welcome to the Art of Being Human. Today we're going to start a section on depression and grief, but I don't want you to feel grief when you've finished watching this, but I do want to give you some kind of an idea as to what it is, how it happens, how it can be categorized, and what you can do to help yourself get better. As I always say, if you're deep into grief, if you're deep into depression and life just doesn't make sense to you anymore, then you may need to get some help with it. Because grief and depression is a lot different than just having a couple of days of the blues. Everybody has a couple of days of the blues every so often, and then it just passes. But if you are going into a clinical depression, then that's something that's a lot more deep, a lot more serious. So let's begin and just talk about depression. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of people that have it. In fact, it's so common among people that it's sometimes called the common cold of emotional disturbances because so many people have it. But also I want to encourage you because it is one of the most treatable illnesses you can have. It is possible, and there are many medications on the market to get treated for depression, and that to win out of it, to win from it. But the thing is, when you have it, it can last and last and last and last. If it starts to last a long time, you're having trouble shaking it, it doesn't seem to go away, and especially if you don't think you've got a reason for it. If you don't think you've got a reason for it and you're very, very depressed, then you need to get help, because it could be a clinical depression, something that's deeper than just an ordinary few days where you don't feel good. So a lot of people have it. Now, there are two types of depression. There's an exogenous, if we can look at this chart for a moment, an exogenous depression or an endogenous depression, and there are differences between them that are significant. Exogenous depression is due to things outside of yourself. In other words, there's nothing going wrong with your brain chemistry, you're not menopausal, there's nothing going on within yourself, within your human system that's causing you to be depressed. In exogenous depression, it's all happening outside of yourself. You have a personal situation that's bad, and that's causing you to feel depressed. Whatever that personal situation is, it could be divorce, it could be the fact that you've lost your job, it could be the fact that your best friend is moving away, anything that's happening to you. It's, in other words, can be called a situational depression. A situational depression is an exogenous depression because it's based upon something that's outside of yourself and not something that's internal in your human body. Losses, rejections, disappointments, abuse, all of this stuff can cause depression. And if you have that, the best way to get rid of it is to handle whatever it is that's causing it to begin with. And you don't have to worry so much about your personal human body, because your own human body isn't doing it. However, I should caution you that an exogenous depression can become endogenous if it bothers you so much and nothing is done about it, and you don't handle it or you can't handle it. Then what will happen is that it becomes internalized. You know, a lot of depression is anger internalized. Instead of being angry, you turn that anger on yourself. It becomes internalized in your system, and then it becomes depression. So a lot of people who are seriously depressed are really angry, but they cannot express the anger, or they're afraid to express the anger. If they're being abused, let's say a husband is abusing his wife, or if it's a child and the child is being abused, it may not be safe to express the anger. Anger should always be expressed in some way, not violently, but expressed in some way so that it gets out of your system, so it becomes recognized. You always need to validate your emotions. That doesn't mean that you're going to stay stuck in them. It doesn't mean that you're not going to do anything about them, but you need to validate the fact, I am angry. This has happened and I'm frustrated and I'm angry and I don't feel good, and then do something if you need to express it. Now, you can express anger in a lot of ways. If you're a female and you're a housewife, you can get down on the floor and on your hands hands and knees and scrub the floor. It's physical activity. It's getting it out. Or if you play sports, you could go into the sports and you realize that you're expressing your anger through the sports. I think maybe that happens a lot in wrestling or boxing. I'm not sure because I'm not a sports kind of person, but what a way, punch, 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 you can get aggression out of your system. If you do not express the emotions that you have, and any emotion, not just anger, but any emotion, but anger is maybe the most prevalent. If you don't express your emotions, you internalize your emotions. And when you internalize your emotions, then you get all kinds of illnesses from it. I mean, ulcers may not be so much the fact that you're angry about something, but that you've internalized something and you did not express it. And by the way, that's not the full answer for ulcers either, because now scientists are finding out that you can have a virus and it'll leave you with an ulcer. You can have certain bacteria and it'll leave you with an ulcer. So the old adage that it's not what you're eating, it's what's eating you that causes an ulcer, that's not necessarily true anymore. Nonetheless, I would just not be complete if I didn't tell you that emotions can be internalized. And when they're internalized, they can cause problems. I'm not saying that that's the only answer to depression, that's the only answer to ulcers or anything like that, but it's one serious consideration. So the exogenous depression is anything that's outside of yourself, and it causes you to be depressed because it's a bad situation. Endogenous depression is something that's going on in your body. For example, your hormones are off, the brain chemicals are off. It's a biochemical problem. There may even be spiritual problems that can cause you to be depressed, but it's something within yourself. And where exogenous depression can become endogenous depression is that it started off outside of yourself due to a bad situation. You didn't handle it or you couldn't handle it. And I'm not saying this judgmentally, because sometimes we just can't handle things. And so it becomes internalized and it gets in you and you become depressed, and then it's more apt to become an endogenous depression. Now, how do you get rid of that? You need to have therapy if it's necessary. You need to take medication if it's necessary. You need to know where that depression comes from. I know a lot of people are depressed. If you look in their backgrounds, they've had a lot of abuse. And the abuse causes a depression. And you have to go back, and just like an onion, you have to kind of peel it away a little bit, a little bit, a little bit, a little bit, until you get the core of it. Then when you get to the core of it, it may not seem so frightening as it was when it first happened to you. Remember this about children and adults. There's a difference in the way they understand things. If you are depressed as an adult, you can go back to your past, you can go into the situations, you can understand the things that happen. Yes, I was abused, but the person who abused me was himself or herself abused, and just carried down because they couldn't handle it. They did it to somebody else, and somebody else saw themselves being abused and thought that was normal behavior, so they abused their children who abused their children, and so forth down the line. But that cycle has to stop sometime. And if you don't know that there is a cycle involved where you think you're just getting abused and this is the way parents handle children, they hit them. Well, I wouldn't. But if you get hit, then you think that's the normal way of raising children, then you will end up by hitting your child. That's the way you were raised and you made it. That's the way your child will be raised, and they'll make it too. And then they perceive that as a normal way of treating children, so they start to abuse their children and so forth. It's almost like a learned behavior. So that has to stop. The only way to stop it as an adult is to take a look at that. If a person is depressed, take a look at that. Who abused you? Why did they abuse you? What happened to you? You may have to live through some of that again, and it can be painful. But when you're finished with all of that, then you start feeling better and you start feeling free and you're done with it. You may remember it, but it doesn't have to raise its head to haunt you again. Once it's over, it's over. And if you remember it, that's not going to hurt you. You just remember it, and then it's over again. You don't have to worry about it strangling you or doing something bad to you, or I can't get rid of it, or it's causing me to be depressed. It's incidences that happen in your life, and this is what happened to you, and it's all over and it's all done with. You don't ever have to go through it again. The pattern does not have to be repeated. You do not have to abuse your child because you were abused. I was talking with a woman and who was abusive or had been abusive, not at that moment, but she had been abusive. And I asked her about her past, and she talked about an uncle who kind of tried to be her boyfriend, and all of a sudden she did something that was so significant that I had to take note of it. Her voice changed, and it's like she became another person. What did she do? She dissociated. In dissociation, you actually take leave of who you are and for the moment become somebody else or like somebody else. You know who you are, you know that you're the same person, but you're not talking the same, you're not feeling the same. Your emotions, your mannerisms may change. And I suddenly realized that's the product of abuse. This person that I was talking to, who herself was abusive, had been abused herself. And when it came time where I was able to kind of get to the core of it and kind of nail it for her, she switched and she became another person. You know, like the three faces of Eve. It wasn't maybe that pronounced, but her voice changed, her mannerism changes, and I realized for the moment she was going back to the time, back to the age when she was a child, and she was abused. She sounded like a child, she acted like a child, she became dissociated into somebody else. There are very pronounced dissociative disorders. And those disorders, they can be categorized. That's where you get your multiple personality disorder, when a person actually becomes or has several personalities within them. And they do have several personalities within them, and they're not faking it. And they have a different name for themselves, and they can talk as it's like they're a complete being. They're a human being. They're just not the same human being. Now, if a person has many personalities, and some have a lot, and it's always due to abuse, you never go into a dissociative disorder unless you've been abused. It's like a trance state. If you've been abused, you will go into it, but you won't go into it normally. I mean, most people would never do it. But when you dissociate and you become like another person, there may be 3 or 4 people in there with you. If you have a multiple personality disorder, it's not called that anymore. It's a dissociative identity disorder, DID. But I've always known it as multiple personality, and I think most people recognize it as that. And so therefore I'll continue to use that term. MPD, multiple personality disorder. And a person can go from one personality to another personality to another personality. It is healable. It's a very serious illness, but it is healable. And how do you get it? You get it from abuse. You get it from abuse that wasn't resolved, and you're still carrying that with you. And in order for a child, in order to get away from abuse, they will slip away from it and their mind will split. This is not a split personality, as they call a split personality, but the mind splits. And when it does, it's like they're in a different time, in a different space, and they don't have to face the abuse because they're not there. Children who are abused will oftentimes have their mind split off into another personality, so they don't have to face or be so aware of the abuse that's happening to them. And I know we used to think of it as a rare disorder, but I don't think of it as a rare disorder. I think of it as much, much more common than what people have been led to believe, because there's much, much more abuse going on than there ever was before. People are being lax in the way they raise their children, or they're being abusive in the way that they raise their children, and the mind just splits right off. But along with that comes a lot of depression and a lot of anxiety and a lot of other symptoms. And when a person actually ends up by going to a counselor, what they're actually doing is saying, I'm depressed, I don't feel good, I'm anxious, I'm nervous, what's wrong with me? And then as you question them and you talk to them more and more and you make sure there's no physical symptoms involved, there's nothing happening to them physically that has to be taken care of, what's going to happen is they're going to show you, and they don't even know they're doing it, you see. They don't know that they have multiple personalities within them. They just don't know it. Until it's brought to their attention, they have no knowledge that they're even doing it. But they'll start to change. Their voice will change. The way they talk will change. They'll talk like a child, or they'll act like a child. The quality of the voices is different. They may, I used to have teddy bears in my office. I do have a teddy bear collection. But when a person went into that state, I could hand him a teddy bear. Hold this. It'll give you comfort if you hold this. And they're sitting there, excuse me, and they're holding the teddy bear to their chest, getting comfort from the teddy bear. And I know that for that moment, they've become another person. So how do you heal it? Well, it takes a special training to do it, but it's very healable. What you do is take all those personalities and you treat each personality separately as it appears. If a person is true MPD, they may have several personalities, and one personality will appear and you'll see a different change, and I'll say, who am I talking to? Who are you? And they'll identify themselves. I'm Maria. Maybe I was talking to Joan before, but this is Maria. Well, Maria, how are you? And she'll tell me things about Joan, or talk about Candy, or other personalities that are within the person. And then you treat that person that is in your presence at that moment. Talk to me about what's going on with you now, because that's really a part of the person who walked in the office. So you treat that person, you get them so they're comfortable. You treat, and I'm not going to tell you how it's treated. I mean, that would be way too complicated for a half-hour show. But you keep treating them, and eventually what is going to happen is those personalities are going to join into the main personality of the person. And then you get a crisis because you have to let that other person know that you're really treating, that they have others within them, and they don't know that. Well, I saw so-and-so, I've talked to so-and-so. You have more than one personality in you. And that can be a shock. Then when they get to the point of healing, they're afraid to lose those personalities because they've had them all along. And they're not sure. It's like losing a personal friend. I don't want Joan to go away. I don't want Candy to go away. They start to recognize the personalities for who they are. They start to become familiar with them, whereas before they didn't even know that they existed. And you let them know gently and gradually what's going on. And then comes the point where you try to get them all together and integrate them into the person so they become one personality. And they're afraid of that, and what you have to do is realize and reassure them, you're not losing the good characteristics of all of these other people that are within you. You're joining all the good characteristics as one to become a part of you. So this is really an integrating process. It's not a process of loss. And when they can accept that and accept that all those different personality characteristics that they had created themselves by splitting off as a protection to the abuse that they've had, when they can all come back together again, then they can heal. And the person becomes one person. They may remember some of these personalities, but they're not controlled by them. Some of the things that we go through, or some of the things that we discuss and that we see in our counseling offices, can be a little bit on the bizarre side. But you have to think, here's a human being that's hurting. Here's a human being that's been abused. What can I do to help them get better? No matter what they've been involved with, no matter what their situation is, they have integrity and they have worth. And you always treat them with integrity and worth. And then as you get into their personalities and find out what's going on, you find out how you can help. Sometimes it takes a specialist care to do all of this. Sometimes you can do it with a counselor can do it on their own without a specialist, but a lot of times it does take a specialist. But you have to have that value of the human being. They're important, they're valuable, and they have worth, and they can be healthy. They've come to you because they're in distress. It's your job. I think with God's help, I don't think we ever heal a person by ourselves. We can help them, though, and God working in us, to make them healthy again to what they need to be. So depression, and I've hardly touched it, I'm going to continue with it next week. Basically exogenous, endogenous, or there can be medical problems involved that's causing the depression. All of these things need to be looked at. Therapy may need to be given, but you also, just to see a counselor and just let everything kind of hang out from week to week to week, however long the counselor wants to see you, however long it's necessary to go, it can cause you to become well again. The brain heals, the body heals, and then you can become well again. Well, I'm going to close it here. We haven't touched on everything, but I'll continue with this next time, and I hope that you will join me then.